Hi, and welcome to another episode of On the Couch, where we collaborate with experts, practitioners, authors, advocates, and influencers to explore current social themes, sex-positive topics, and share stories and insights that matter.
This podcast was recorded on Aboriginal country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that were never ceded, on which we live, work, and record upon.
We pay our respect to elders past and present, and to those who may be visiting our website or listening to our podcast today.
While listening, we encourage you to practice good self-care. And of course, check the show notes for further information.
Wherever you are, whatever you're doing,
enjoy this episode of On the Couch.
I'm Winnie Adamson, and I'm with my co-host and friend, Maddy Stratton.
Hi, Winnie. I'm really looking forward to today's episode as we're talking about something that is becoming increasingly central to young people's lives: how they learn about sex, relationships, and consent in digital spaces.
Yes, and this raises some big questions around strength-based approaches and supporting young people in navigating these really important topics online.
And to help unpack this with us more, we are joined by two incredible researchers working in the intersection of sexuality education, digital cultures, and sexual violence prevention. Hello and welcome on the couch, Dr. Giselle and Dr. Sarah.
Hi. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I want to move into using the concepts of fields of existence and coordinates of belonging to introduce our guests, Giselle and Sarah. These concepts by co-culture communications demonstrate that our beings are a field of activity made up of the stories that have been told, our ancestors that have existed, the lands under our feet, and the places where we stand, and all of these forces form who we are in this moment as contextual beings. So we'd love to start with you, Giselle. How do you define and locate yourself, and what are your coordinates of belonging?
Well, thank you so much for introducing me to this concept. I thought it was a really cool way of working out where you belong and where you come from. So I guess my name's Giselle Woodley. My parents were both immigrants, and my father came to the UK and my mother from Calcutta in India. And growing up, in terms of my bloodlines and knowing where I come from, has actually been a little bit tricky because I never truly felt like I belonged. So I'm first generation Australian. Never truly felt like I could call myself a person of colour. Half my family have experienced horrendous racism, which continues to grow, I would mention, in so-called Australia, due to immigrants and Indians being labelled as the scapegoat for the housing crisis in Australia. But I've never really truly felt I can claim I'm white either. So I grew up with mixed cultures, and that spills over into a lot of elements of life. So individualism versus collectivism, which has certainly become more prominent as I've had a child and seeing those differences in bringing up a child, family being a village versus more self-serving needs. I guess with my two backgrounds as well, I'm also come from the colonizer and the colonized, and that manifests in different ways as well. In India, like much of the world, patriarchy is alive and well. And I come from a long line of women in my bloodline who've been silenced, oppressed, and limited. And I live, work, and grew up on the unceded lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation in Perth Bulu on the West Coast. And the lands that shape my bloodlines and so-called Australia are experiencing rising sexual violence rates. And like some people here as well, I studied sexology, and I sort of learnt that evidence suggests that sexual knowledge has the potential to contribute to individual and sexual well-being and ultimately can reduce sexual violence. So this understanding underpins a lot of my work and my social activism drive, and I yearn for better ways to prevent sexual violence rates as a victim survivor myself. And I think this also spills into the digital realm, which is where I've sort of found myself working. And I'm committed to this work, and I want to know other ways of working. And I deeply value social justice, empathy, human rights, connection, and pleasure, I would say as well.
Thanks so much for sharing, Giselle. Sarah,
Thank you.
we'll jump right in to you. What are your coordinates of belonging?
Yes, I grew up in a small town in Western Australia, and my mum and dad were fruit and vegetable farmers, and they worked every day except for Christmas and Easter. So I grew up in a labouring family in a really isolated town. And I feel really very lucky, actually, to say that I have parents that are still in love, even though it grosses us out. They still share kisses and cuddles on the couch, and they treat each other with lots of respect. But growing up, something that my mum always said to me and to my younger sister is that the one thing she wanted for us in life was to never have to rely on a man for anything. She said it so much, and I think from a young age, this really planted a little feminist seed in me. And I was always thinking so much about what it meant to be a woman in a man's world. So fast forward a few decades, I feel very connected to my queer community. I feel very connected to the different people in my life that bolster my flourishing. But unfortunately, as a victim survivor of sexual violence, in a lot of ways, I also yearn very deeply for what my life might have been like if I didn't have those experiences. So even though I know education is only one pillar of prevention, I often think about how different my life would have turned out if I had been taught from my head to my toes what I say goes, or that I'm the boss of my own body. It's sometimes a very bitter pill to swallow that I will never know that person, but at the same time, I'm also very, very proud of the person I have become and that I have this responsibility to research sexual violence, which I know is not something that's possible for all victim survivors.
Thank you so much for sharing. It's beautiful to hear your backstories and what's really enforced and reinformed your work, because it's both very clear how passionate you are about the work that you do. And so it's wonderful to have you join us today to hear all about that. For those listeners who might not know, Giselle and Sarah are both core members of BlueMed, which is a national advocacy peak body committed to ensuring evidence-based relationships and sexuality education is accessible to all people in their homes, schools, communities, and online spaces.
When we talk about comprehensive sexuality and relationships education, or as we'll call it today, RSE, many people may first think about school-based or even whole-of-community approaches, and we have explored these on the couch here in our past episodes.
Yes, we have. We have talked with Katrina Marson, Tom and Adi from Sticky Cues, Dr. Tessa Opie and Karen Bradfield, who have all shared important strategies on promoting relational well-being and reducing sexual violence. And we'll link to those episodes in the show notes.
But today we want to shift the conversation slightly and unpack RSE in the digital landscape, building on discussions that we had last season with Professor Kath Aubrey about digital capabilities for sexual and reproductive health. As we know, the reality is that for many young people, learning about bodies, sex, relationships, and identity doesn't just happen in school-based settings anymore. It's happening online. And by online, we're talking about social media platforms, search engines, and creator-led content. We know that young people are turning to social media and online communities to find information and explore topics that they might not feel comfortable discussing elsewhere. At the same time, we're seeing increasing debate and honestly a lot of confusion around how young people should access sexual health and sex education in online spaces, especially with the latest restrictions and I guess introductions of industry codes.
Yeah, sexual health organizations, educators, and clinicians are already navigating restrictive content moderation policies, algorithmic suppression, and what's often referred to as shadow banning, where sexual health content becomes less visible or harder to find online. And we see some of this when we're promoting On the Couch and other sexual health information on social media.
Yeah, that's right. That social media censorship is real for us. And we're also hearing a lot of questions like, how do digital platforms govern sexual content? And how do we reach young people and support their digital sexual literacy, autonomy, and access to accurate information online? Giselle, your work sits right at the intersection of all of these conversations, looking at digital governance, image-based abuse, AI deepfakes, and technology-facilitated sexual violence. How should we be thinking about the role of digital spaces in RSE?
Great question, and I totally feel you on the algorithmic suppression. If I'm not posting about sex and porn, I'm posting depressing content about the ongoing genocides that are facing. So digital platforms have a field day with suppressing all my content, all of which come under the codes. So I don't know about you guys, but I'm starting to see it even further suppressed in light of the industry codes, which is a really, really difficult space to work in. And I think really, really important issues that we should be able to talk about. But there's usually no concessions made for like human rights, educational content, and digital content. And I guess that comes back to thinking about the role of digital spaces in RSE. And my PhD research looked at Australian Australian teens and their perspectives of pornography, but as well as pornography, how they learn about sex and relationships and how porn was played a role in that as well. And I think, we have the SASH survey run by La Trobe, and there's been a number of other studies where we can see that young people are growingly using other sources of information, or were. It's going to be interesting to see what's happened in light of the social media ban. But what came through before our research, before the industry codes or the social media ban had been implemented, is that young people using online, as well as their friends who were getting probably their information from online sources, online was their main source of information. And so parents, they were great to talk about values and attitudes in relation to sex, and then you could bring back to the family home those different beliefs about such emotional, personable information. And then schools tended to communicate the biological, mechanical aspects of sex, but not mentioning the word sex as something that they relate as well, that sex tends to be talked around, not about. And so they wanted this nuanced information and more in-depth information, and digital spaces were so core to that. And that includes pornography, which a few young people, particularly queer young people, mentioned that it was an important source of information for them. And that, I think we tend to focus on the terrible aspects. We tend to disconnect it from its purpose as a masturbatory aid, in terms of sexual pleasure, which teens brought up. A couple of teens also brought up that they weren't going to go to their mum to talk about going down on a woman. So, but they wanted to know that information. They're curious beings. They have information at their fingertips. They want to be, they want to know this information, and they're not going to go to their parents. And they recognize that there's this unspoken line that what can be spoken about in schools. And we know there'd be community backlash as well if schools were to tackle these sorts of things in the detail that teenagers want. And so, yeah, it really comes down to rights. The human rights, despite gender, age, sexuality, and any other given factor, that you should have rights to sexual information and expression in the way that you see fit.
Yeah, especially when we're talking about this tension, I guess, in protecting young people and also making sure that they can still access that accurate information. And as you were saying, a very current conversation around online regulation is happening right now. It's happening right now. It's happening with the rollout of these new industry codes. This new phase requires, I guess, social media and porn sites to prevent under 18s from accessing material featuring pornography, violence, self-harm, suicide, and disordered eating. It's a really big conversation, and I guess that's why we're here today, thinking about the value of age verification as a first line of defense to protect young children from accidentally accessing harmful content, while also recognizing that the increase of surveillance and reduced privacy can impact young people's access to sexual health education content online. I'd like to hand over to the both of you to share your reflections on this, and also thinking about if this current approach is in fact strengths-based.
I can start off. Giselle will be able to speak more specifically about the industry codes than I will be able to. But I'll say that this kind of surveillance and suppression, in my perspective, and I feel like others share this perspective, it doesn't come from a strengths-based perspective.
Right.
Firstly, there's very little good quality research showing a link between young people using violence and pornography consumption, and maybe Giselle can talk a bit more about the research that's out there. But even for argument's sake, let's say that there was, young people are largely accessing porn, like Giselle said, because they're curious and they want to learn about sex. So acknowledging that young people are craving knowledge and skill building, and it could have been an opportunity to fill that gap and build their agency to navigate the digital world. This could have been achieved by including content on digital literacy in the mandatory curriculum, improving RSE and other mechanisms to fill that gap, or providing adequate funding for teacher upskilling on how to actually talk to young people about explicit content online.
That was beautifully said. And I totally agree. It's sort of, we've done a bit of research over the years of teens' perspectives of regulation of pornography as well, and specifically their perceptions of age verification measures. And although the Australian government committed to $6.5 million age assurance trial, which has been released now, you can read that if you don't mind going through hundreds of pages of very tech-heavy language. But there's quite a few age verification measures that they've gone through in that for the industry codes and both the social media ban that platforms have to adhere to, or they have a selection, but they all have pitfalls or concerns. So it's usually the effectiveness is balanced with security and privacy of information. So a lot of these age verification methods depend on a third-party provider and us trusting that third-party provider basically when data is the most valuable commodity in the world. So I think when we were talking to teens about age verification, they sort of suggested they could use workarounds. They're going to use VPNs, which we're seeing the VPN apps top the charts. We saw a 1,400% increase in the UK when they implemented age verification for porn. So we know that that porn's not necessarily being reduced in consumption. We just know that people are using VPNs and they're getting more tech savvy. And people who didn't know what a VPN was certainly do this week. So yeah, teens relate that they value education far more than any regulatory measure, and they pointed out that the impacts of pornography, that they would be much better discussed in a classroom as part of a comprehensive suite of sexuality education skills. Yeah, I think that's all I could just say. I've probably got a lot more to say, but I don't want to keep it go too techy.
Yeah. Otherwise, we might need to have a tech dictionary that we roll out along with the episode just so that we can go back and be like, VPN. No, that's so fine. Yeah, I just want to continue this conversation around these online environments and I guess exposing young people to harm, but as you say, can be a really powerful space for learning, peer support, also thinking about the access to sexual health information, of course. How do we balance those two realities, Giselle?
It's a really tricky question and something I'm trying to personally answer and address in public policy and advocate for young people's rights. Because it is such a fine balance, but I think protection, or at least under the guise of protection of children, these different implementations, I think, and I'm going to go a bit more techie, I guess, is because with the accelerated use of VPNs, it's going to be interesting to see if then start banning VPNs for various reasons. So VPNs obscure someone's IP address so you can reroute it to a different country or location. So people can bypass the Pornhub ban or whatever else they're trying to do. But Denmark last year tried to ban VPN use, but due to public backlash, circled back on that. But we do know in the age assurance trial details that they were playing with digital ID. And so I guess it's sort of like this protection of children and young people. And you know, sexual information is caught in the crossfire, and that's not just for teenagers as well. So I think balancing those realities is making sure that we are recognizing human rights for all individuals, despite age, gender, sexuality, race, etc., culture. And there's so much attention to the harms and the safety and protection that in my work I try and advocate for those freedoms of expression and information because they're not as well supported, I don't think. I think it's so much focus on safety and harm that people are forgetting about young people's rights and adults' rights as well. And this is something we can advocate for in schools and individual levels, wider communities, to consider these rights and autonomy and the agency of young people, which I think is really overlooked and so vital.
Right, yeah.
And I'd love to keep diving into that, talking about what we're focusing on, this like safety aspect and harm reduction and minimization. But what are some of the ways that we can have more effective solutions that look at protecting young people from harm without minimizing their autonomy and their sexual rights and access to that accurate information?
Do you know what's really interesting? So I pointed out that young people really valued pornography as a beneficial source of sexual information. And although there's evidence to suggest that the detail in which they were doing that, I wasn't quite prepared for when I was conducting the research. But I will say that teenagers also relayed that they recognized that pornography as a whole was not an ideal sexuality educator. And that's because of the widespread we can't really say that anymore, but the widespread accessibility and usually the algorithms driving them to aggressive content. And a lot of them were looking for soft, romantic, loving depictions of sex and not always able to find that. And they wanted these visual representations of sex. So although they were noting that, look, in an ideal world, it probably wouldn't actually be pornography as a sexuality educator, but they were thinking if there was informative representations of sex and bodies, and that's what they want to watch porn for. They're using it as somewhat of a guide, even if that wasn't the initial intention, and that's not always a good thing. So yeah, in more practical terms, I think filling those gaps of information is so important. That's why I really advocate for digital spaces But then our young people are being repressed and infantilized, So if they want to role play their sexual scenarios, which our research with adults in the UK has found that that's a great way to explore sexual identity, and sexual expression, that's now also repressed. So they're constantly having these spaces limited to them. And I think that's really, really crucial for queer, rural-based people of colour and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teens especially, who are more affected by these different changes, basically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it does make me think about, how even consent is role played in media and seeing a bit more of that in TV shows and film recently, which is really cool to see. But I'd love to see even more of that because that's also something that is not seen in pornography as well. Because it is so interesting, this idea that digital spaces can support young people's sexual health literacy rather than simply being framed as risk environments. As you mentioned before, the SASH survey, it does remind me of Professor Jennifer Power's work when she spoke with us on the couch. Last year, she talked about online spaces acting as important entry points for young people seeking information about sex and relationships. And we are meeting with her again this year to explore the 2026 results from that survey, which is exciting.
Awesome.
Yeah, I want to bring you back into the conversation, Sarah, particularly when we start thinking about how the digital spaces intersect with sexual violence prevention. When we think about technology facilitated sexual violence, it's clear that education, digital literacy, and consent conversations are also increasingly happening in online spaces too. I'm thinking the Teach Us Consent digital campaign is such a good example of this.
Yeah.
But from your perspective, how do you see RSE, digital literacy, and violence prevention intersecting online? And how can we support and help equip young people to navigate these digital environments safely?
Yeah, thank you. And I think that it's important to start off by acknowledging that digital campaigns like #MeToo and also the Teach Us Consent campaign, they are often critiqued for being quite narrow in their scope, in largely focusing on white, heterosexual, and middle-class cohorts. So although they seem powerful, oftentimes they're powerful in platforming certain voices and other voices get left behind. So I think that's always important to mention when we think about digital campaigning. But to answer your question, I think it's also really important to acknowledge that for young people and for all of us, the digital world and the real world are completely enmeshed. A huge amount of friendship, like Giselle was saying before, and relationship building is online, or opportunities to role play online. This includes navigating conflict. And because we're not really treating the digital world as a real world, we're not seeing social and emotional literacy for digital contexts taken seriously as important for sexual violence prevention. Not in all spaces. The crossroads of RSE, digital spaces, and sexual violence is where very, very challenging issues fester. A really good example is something that I know educators have been dealing with for well over a decade is non-consensual image sharing. This is sending nudes around. It's a failure of RSE, it's a failure of digital literacy, and it's obviously sexual violence, and this continues to happen. And we're still seeing it at very heightened rates. I haven't seen anywhere that it's gotten any better. But yeah, it really is the intersection of those three things where these challenges emerge. And I guess it would feel very disingenuous for me to sit here and sprout different ways that educators can equip young people with the tools they need to navigate digital spaces, because we know that teachers are more often than not very under-resourced and often not trained in RSE. We know there's not good enough government funding to ensure young people across Australia have access to good quality RSE, no matter what their postcode is. And we know that we're living in a time where there's really heightened resistance to this work, especially for gender and sexuality inclusion. There's a lot of different challenges and resistances that we're fighting against. Ultimately, we know that telling young people not to do something won't work. We've learnt this time and time again, like when sex ed was focused on abstinence and sex in marriage, we know it has the opposite effect. So from a strengths-based perspective, a piece of advice that I always like to keep handy, I guess, and I know it's easier said than done, is that I think it's really important to ensure that young people have opportunities to build community. And this could be online, in person in schools, and hopefully outside of schools as well. Because the research shows that even when people have knowledge about a topic or something's wrong, it's the peer influence that's way more influential. And we see this with bystander intervention, where people know they're seeing something that's wrong, but they're not going to intervene if it's their friend, or if they're with friends who are laughing. There's no way. And that's, yeah, there's so much research to support that. So I think enabling young people's access to cultures of care is so important.
I love that. I actually just thought of a quote then by Bruce Perry, which is, "There's nothing more influential than a neurologically safe relationship." And I just feel like that backs up what you're saying about that, because it is so important that we have community connect us. And I think it's something that we're constantly, all of us, especially young people, are lacking in at times. So thanks so much for sharing that perspective on community and peer cultures. Giselle, did you want to jump in and say anything here?
I guess more it makes me I think about online communities and how important they are to teenagers, and it just really makes me lament these legislative changes, because they really disconnect young people, particularly rural-based young people, from their communities. And I guess just circling back to kind of what Sarah said about they need the skills to navigate digital spaces, that's become clear. It's really vital and important. And the message they're receiving, according to the teens we're researching, is, activities and sexual expressions such as sexting or intimate communications, they're just told blanket, no, don't do it. Digital footprint, all the dangers, it could be leaked, etc. And then I ask teens, well, is that working? And they say, absolutely not. There's daily nudes sent, and the social media ban didn't prohibit messaging services, so that hasn't gone. So yeah, I think young people need to be equipped with digital skills, and it comes back down to base level comprehensive sexuality education skills as well. And I think we need to come back to that about, even in digital spaces, we need to respect each other's bodies as we would and should in real life as well. And we saw that happening on Grok with non-consensual AI generated imagery. So young people have this new technology they've got to contend with, where even if they haven't shared a nude can be made of them. And it really comes back to those skills that we need to teach people. You don't do that. You have to respect each other. And there absolutely needs to be consent and respect.
Thanks. Sarah, I really want to focus on your work and that strength-based approaches to sexual violence prevention. So your research actually really pushes the boundaries of conventional prevention approaches, being grounded in feminist frameworks and art-based methodologies, centering affirming sexual experiences, agency, and community connection. So historically, I think violence prevention initiatives have quite focused on that individual risk and reducing harm. But recently, we're starting to see more of a shift and focus on active learning at the heart of prevention. It makes me think of last year, our episode with Katrina Martin, and she talked of sexual well-being as the baseline we're aiming for, and sexual violence prevention being supplementary to that. So can you talk to your work, particularly how you are contributing to debates challenging these dominant frameworks?
I'll start off by saying I'm always happy when Katrina Martin is thought of when people are thinking about my work. She's such an icon and also one of our friends. So that's very lovely. When I started doing research, I noticed that all of the studies that have been done in sexual violence, and obviously not all of them, but a very big portion, were really heavily focused on identifying risks and figuring out how to mitigate those risks. So at the time, there was very little research focusing on the strengths that people or communities already have and how prevention can work to bolster or further those strengths. So for example, in sexual violence studies, there was a real absence of research exploring how young adults are having really great intimate sex and thinking about how we can use this knowledge to inform prevention. So that's what I did in one portion of my PhD. I spoke to young adults about how they navigate sex and what sex actually means to them, instead of focusing on the negative and figuring out how to mitigate those sexual violence experiences from the deficit. And of course, that has a place as well, but strengths-based frameworks should work alongside that. So they shift prevention away from managing risk to cultivation and possibility by thinking about how we can nurture environments and relationships and structural conditions that enhance people's experiences of sex. So my colleague, Dr. Sophie Hines, and I have started developing some principles for doing strengths-based sexual violence research, and they're works in progress, but just briefly, we believe that research, like I said, should shift from deficit-based narratives to looking as well at the positive influences on sexuality. So not just focusing on harm, there needs to be puzzle pieces that also focus on how people build great intimacy in their everyday lives. The second principle is, instead of viewing sexual violence and consent as just a moment of communication, which I should preface this by saying consent is what a lot of sexual violence prevention work focuses on. So we should be examining the broader structures and influences that shape our sexual experiences. So, for example, factors like heteronormativity, transphobia, ableism, and many more that shape our experiences. And lastly, we believe that strengths-based approaches should actively challenge and transform gender norms, roles, and relations, and power imbalances that shape sexual agency. So this obviously goes beyond the gender binary that positions men as potential perpetrators and women as potential victims. And we believe that when we centre strengths rather than deficits in sexual violence research, we can create prevention efforts that not only just want to work to reduce the likelihood of experiencing or perpetrating harm, but also nurture cultures of meaningful connection where empathy, care, and ethical and positive friendships and relationships become the norm.
It also reminds me, Sarah, of you talking about strength-based, of why pleasure is so important to speak about in the classroom, and people really shy away from it. And we're so focused on consent, but we're finding that teens are conceptualizing consent as permission, where women tend to be the gatekeepers of the consent and males tend to be the seekers of consent. And it's quite a problematic way to look at it. And it's creating fears in young people about having sex. We're seeing in the demographics we're speaking to. But if you were to center pleasure, which I'm sure you would see as a strength-based approach, and if teens know that it's meant to be mutually pleasurable, this sexual experience, it's not just I want to get off and have it off with someone. It's meant to be this dance that you do together. And I think more emphasis on that would be so beautiful in RSE as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely agree with that. I think that often focusing on that deficit frameworks really push to young people to think, well, how far can I go? Rather than, well, what do I want to pleasure or have experience in?
Yeah.
Thanks. It makes so much sense thinking about those approaches and really shifting that focus. I think something that really stands out to me is your prevention approaches, recognizing capacities, strengths, and lived expertise of individuals and communities, particularly those historically marginalized within mainstream prevention research. And I love to hear you're focusing on those areas and promoting them more in your work. It's really important that we're promoting more of these diverse experiences to young people as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing both of your research and passion with us. There are these really strong themes that I think we can all hear that underlines both of your work, the importance of advocacy in this space and the work that you both do at BloomEd. I'm also thinking about evidence-based comprehensive RSE as the key driver for creating positive and safe outcomes that ultimately increase individual well-being, support healthy relationships, and reduce sexual and gender-based violence. I know, Sarah, that you're having to jump off now and head to a really exciting event at Archer. So congratulations on 2 big speaking events in one day. And thank you for making time for us. But we might say goodbye to you now and then pass over the final question to Giselle.
Thank
And
you
you
so
speak
much.
you speak so beautifully, Sarah. I could listen to you all day.
Right?
Yeah, the same way about you. Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks again for allowing Giselle and I to present together. And yeah, this has been so lovely. I look forward to listening to the rest of it.
Yes. Thanks, Sarah, and all
Bye.
the
Thank you.
best. Bye. Giselle, as co-founder of BloomEd and reflecting on the value of advocacy, can you share your experience of the group's inception, BloomEd's impact, and their growth?
Yeah, sure. So, Bloomhead started at the beginning of COVID. What a lovely time.
Mm,
And I've been thinking that wanted to do more social advocacy, and then Dr. Jackie Hendricks, who is the course coordinator for sexology, put out a call out for something very similar. I thought, oh my God, I've been trying to build something like this. So I reached out to her, and myself, Jackie, and a couple of other members formed BloomEd. It was very loose, and we just knew we wanted to advocate for better relationships and sexuality education. We've grown over the years. We've got a great team at the moment. We've got quite a diverse group and a lot of focus on sexual health and disability, which is really lovely
mm,
that we're starting to branch out. Brought Sarah on board. Sarah and I actually met. I think her supervisor recommended that she meet with me because she was in Perth but studying at RMIT in Melbourne, and I'd written a conversation article, and her supervisor said, reach out to this person. We ended up having like a little walk around a lake, and the rest is history now.
I
Where
love that.
we include each other in lots of projects. She came and worked with us when I was working at Curtin on some sexual violence projects, and then BloomEd, and then now we still write papers, and she's awesome. But yeah, BloomEd was focused on basically particularly policy in terms of where we can make a difference and where our skill base sits. So creating campaigns for things like better teacher training. At the moment, we're doing one about the industry codes and age
Mm,
verification and social media, and we're hoping to go to different MPs. And we've written some letters for more conservative MPs and more progressive MPs because they have different priorities, but they definitely there's still parts of these codes and regulations that will concern them both. So that's
mm,
our next on our plate, as well as a big teacher training campaign. But yeah.
cool.
So it's cool to hear about BloomEd. Maddie and I actually met you last year, you and Sarah, at World Association of Sexual Health Congress,
I
Yeah.
where
remember.
a brainstorming session with BloomEd on collaborative advocacy for better sex education. And
Mm,
it's really great to connect with so many like-minded people and work together to unpack and think critically, not just practically, about
yeah.
these big topics on what we can actually be doing to drive change in the space. I know we did a lot of brainstorming on big butcher's pieces of paper and broke up into great groups and have really informative chats. So where has this session taken you? Where is BloomEd going? What's coming next?
Hmm. Thank you so much. That session was so cool because it was on really early in the morning. We didn't expect anyone to
Yeah.
come, especially out at the end of a conference and you're all shell of a human.
Yeah. We were
But
going to be there. We made sure that we got our
oh,
coffee early that day and we got down there.
thanks so much. It was so lovely to see. We were just absolutely stoked that people got up early because if it was me, I probably wouldn't, but I had to. But yeah, we did a lot of brainstorming and on Butcher's paper. And actually, you're
Mm,
really reminding me that we should let other people know how they can get involved. So something
Yeah.
we have started doing, I mean, a lot of our communications are over WhatsApp, where we sort of we like to share opportunities because really you can only go for policy submissions if you know about them. So it's usually
Mm,
someone gets wind of something. We're trying to have representation in all states and territories in Australia, which we don't quite have yet. We don't really have anyone in South Australia, Northern Territory, or Tasmania, which is a gap we would love to fill.
mhm.
But we've also built a community garden so that people who don't want to necessarily be on the committee and do the boring work, they can still sort of share opportunities or let us know that a policy thing is happening, or if we can reach out to the community. So please do feel free to jump on the Bloom Ed site and ask to join the community if you'd like to. But we have a few campaigns we're about to start on. We've had a teacher training campaign we've had on the back burner for a little bit, and also the industry code regulation campaign. But they actually really tie into each other because,
Right.
especially when you're rallying MPs, you need to give them specific points of what you want done. You can't just have a wishy-washy meeting and hope for the best. I think having really specific recommendations or actions that they can take. And one of the actions is teacher training because we had consent education come in, mandatory consent education, which is a very progressive, welcome addition to the curriculum. But there was no extra support for
Mm,
educators. And that's possibly why I relayed that teenagers are conceptualizing justice permission, it's probably because there's no training.
Mm.
So a core part of that campaign, which ties into both of them, is that there really needs to be more support and funding and training for teachers. So that's really what we're going to be focusing in the coming months on.
Yeah, great. And I heard also that that you've got a new master's student, is that right?
Yeah, we have
Lydia
Lydia
Strode.
Jupp working with us
Yeah,
at the
great.
moment. And Lydia is an amazing writer, writes for the Star Observer, and used to work for End Rape on Campus as well. And they're a fabulous writer, so watch this space for much more finessed position statements and some nice writing. We're really looking forward to Lydia working with us as well.
Yeah, great. And also, just really cool to see how people who are listening today can get involved in advocacy. I think a lot of people think about advocacy and think, yes, that's something I want to do, but how do I do it? And who do I talk to? And what does
Mm,
it practically actually look like in real life?
yeah.
So really cool to have Bloom Ed to jump on board with.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about this a lot because I mean, I definitely never thought I'd end up in research or do a PhD. No bloody way. But I've realized now that I'm in it, it's a fantastic advocacy tool. And I think with advocacy more broadly, it's sort of play on your strengths. If you're good
Mm,
at doing art or you're a good talker or you're good at social media or research, play to your strengths and advocate in your communities and the spaces that you have access to and the ways that you can. So I also do advocacy for the multiple genocides going on. And we ran a fundraiser last year for Gaza, but we used art as our medium so that we could get artists involved and people were doing face painting and fake psychic readings for donations and just silly things that we're trying to get the community involved. And we ended up raising $25,000 that we were able to distribute through families and things. But it doesn't
mm,
also have to be, money's also doesn't solve all the problems. And I think I've learned that the hard way in trying to get money into Gaza has been really tricky. And
mm,
even with sex ed here, money doesn't solve the issue. So yeah, I think playing to your strengths,
mm,
knowing that you have a voice and using that voice, even if it's just to your friends and family,
mm,
to advocate for what you need. And because those have follow-on effects as well. Whatever conversation you have, whatever impact you have, however small, that has a follow-on effect. And I think that's part of advocacy too, is knowing you don't have to like move mountains or write these really long policy
mm.
submissions, but there's other ways to be an activist and advocate for more social justice at multi levels of the community as well.
Yeah, I really, I guess, resonate with that, even in talking about sex and relationships and consent and sexual violence prevention and just being really open in talking about that. I know 10 years ago, before I started working in this space, I maybe wouldn't have started talking about it. Then I became
Mm,
more comfortable. I had the language. I built my own capacity. And then now all of a sudden, it's a very common conversation that we're having, at our share house or at the kitchen table at my parents' place. And we're talking about these conversations. And I feel as though that is also part of advocating for these really important topics is talking about it, even at that really small level. So yeah, really
and
cool to
I
hear how you speak about that.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is more important than you probably give credit for it as
Yes.
well, because I
Yeah.
do think the stigmatization of sex is part of the issue. The
Mm,
sexual violence, it's surrounded in mystery and it's this mysterious thing and it's this taboo that you can't talk about. And that's something we can all do. We can help destigmatize sex because that's part of the issue. And
mm,
that will, doing this all the way around will help destigmatize and help reduce that taboo so it's not so wrapped around in this taboo that then becomes eroticized and
mm.
in a harmful way. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, of course. And it's really cool just to hear, I guess, the really inspiring vision that BloomEd has and the direction that you're going. And I guess really in the time that we're in, really feel the value of this work. So thanks for sharing that. Before
Thanks so
we
much.
before we finish up, would love to leave some space for you, Giselle, to share any final thoughts that you have for our listeners, especially in how people can continue to engage in this conversation and advocate for RSE. We'll, of course, have all of the links discussed in today's episode and that Sarah and Giselle have shared with us beforehand. We'll have them all in the show notes. But we'd like to just hand over to you now, Giselle, to leave us with your final thoughts.
Well, I think building on what you said, having those conversations is so important, destigmatizing. But I think also, in addition to that, is being curious. It's something I've learned to be as a researcher. I've gone through my own journey of I kind of came in with really negative thoughts about pornography, and I realized I wasn't really open to what the research was saying. And I think being continuously curious is so, so important, and being open-minded, because nothing is black and white. There's so much nuance in all our different areas, and understanding those complexities as individuals, not just as researchers or educators or content creators, I think is so important. And being curious is part of that. It's being curious and being open. And if you are, you might learn something. And that helps to be a good advocate as well, because you can then see that nuance, and it helps discussion and fosters interesting debate.
Thanks for listening to On the Couch. We create this podcast because we are allies in actively challenging discrimination, microaggressions, and exclusionary behaviours.
We want to create spaces where people feel safe to share their thoughts, knowing that they will be heard and respected. Such an environment fosters collaboration, innovation, and contributes to a more inclusive society.
Follow us on your favourite podcast platform. That way you will receive every new episode when it's released. You can also help us grow the podcast by giving us a rating and leaving us a review.
Connect with us on Instagram and Facebook, and share On the Couch with your friends, colleagues, and family.
On the Couch is made by the team at Caddyshack Project. Until next time, peace, love, and protection.